So you are at your office.
I'm at my office in Cambridge.
So I'm holding on my hand. This is the book.
Yeah.
This is the first book I have ever published in my career, 2019, just before the COVID.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And then last year I reprinted the second upgraded version of the book.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And then also this one as well, last year as well.
The survival book. Yeah.
The survival. And so it is a great kind of inspiration for a lot of Vietnamese citizens as well as officers to understand about the city and how to, where to invest, how to find a job and what to do. It's great to have you today. And
I'm happy to be here.
can we begin by something very basic? What is a proper definition of a city?
So I define a city as the absence of physical space between people. Cities are defined by their density, their proximity, their closeness. It's not a 1-0 thing. There's a gradation. There's a gradation of spaces, which become more urban or less urban, depending on how much activity there is within them. There also are people's lives, which are more or less urban. So I am right now, in a city in Massachusetts, but I woke up this morning in a space that's much less dense. And so the sleeping part of my life is not urban, but the waking part of my life is by and large urban. So all of these are gradations on a scale of urbanity, if you will.
Does this derive from the Greek word polis? Is that the same?
So they're all related. So the Greek word polis is one root of this. The direct antecedent of city is civitas, which is Latin, not Greek. And it means, in some sense, there are two Latin words which relate to city. One is urbs, from which we get urban. The other is civitas, from which we get city. Urbs refers more to the physical structure. Civitas refers more to the human structure. And in some sense, I like that. I like making that distinction because, in fact, in my view, the true city is always humanity. It's not the structures, it's not the skyscrapers, it's the human beings that are connected by proximity.
So in this politics nowadays and in the past, does this always related to city,
Well, sure, because the original political units of Greece were cities, were polises. I guess, when you look at a place like Sparta, which is very non-urban, it's hard to sort of see that exactly. But certainly Athens was a polis, and the managing of that city would have been politics, or the roots of the word economics are in political economy, which is in managing the household of the city or managing the household of the government.
Do you see the changes in politics? How we manage the city from the Greek time until now.
Well, sure. You're asking for a vast evolution on this. So Athens, of course, was a limited democracy, right? There were a certain number of citizens who were allowed to vote. Athens was defeated by Sparta, which had an interesting system of having two kings at the same time. Rome, which in some sense is the greatest greatest city in the history of the West, Rome undergoes this evolution from a kingdom under the Tarquin kings to a republic of sorts. But remember, it's really more of an oligarchy during the time of the republic, and then it falls to being an imperial city for the last 500 years of the first 1200 years of its existence. Then it is more or less ruled by its popes for the next 1400 years, right? It's by and large ruled by the religious leaders who would emerge after the fall of the empire as being central. And then it's been part of the kingdom and then the Republic of Italy for the last 150 years. So these all evolved. The problems of urbanity remain. right? I mean, the problems, which if you think about Rome, Rome was dealing with sewers under the Tarquin king. So the Cloaca Maxima, the famous sewers of Rome, were being built then. The aqueducts, which were so central in bringing clean water to the city, those were built throughout its time period. Um, Dealing with defense was central. So Rome was repeatedly attacked by different countries, and figuring out how to build walls or other forms of protection. Those things continue to go on. And so no matter what government is technically in charge of the city, they have to manage more or less the same things. There's a famous line by New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, which is there's no democratic or Republican way to clean the streets. And that remains true. There's no, socialist way or capitalist way. Streets need to be cleaned. And so that's what cities must constantly fight over, is to get those streets clean, to make those cities healthy.
Can you give me a little bit more detail about that term, a semi-city?
So a person can live in a semi-city, which by sleeping at night in a forest and going to work in a day in a city. So that's a half urban life. Cities can be half urban in the sense that they are at medium level densities. So, if you think about the sort of car cities of the American West, they're sort of cities, but they're not, they're neither sort of dense and compact in the way that we think of a New York or a Beijing as being. But of course, they still do allow some form of connection. I mean, I would say Silicon Valley, for example, is sort of a semi-city. Silicon Valley is interesting because it has medium-level densities, but it still manages to have enormous concentration in technology, in part by being sort of very focused on a single sector. And that makes it, in some sense, less urban as well, right? So the more that you have in terms of multiple sectors interacting with each other, the more urban a space feels and becomes.
I have been living in Hanoi, the capital city of Vietnam, since 2007. But it's difficult for me to define its characteristics. In the book, you can see that there's a city for the rich, there's a city for the poor. But in Hanoi, the people with more knowledge are isolated in old building, quite unique to Hanoi. They don't really participate in the robust community in the street or in the working area. So mostly on the street there are students and people. Out of 8 million of the citizens of Hanoi, there are 3 million of students and people. And also there are shipper, building worker. So what kind of challenge or threat that Hanoi might face in the near future?
Well, first of all, you tell me you have a city of 8 million, with 3 million of them are young and learning and excited about getting knowledge. I tell you, that's a great future.
Yes.
That's exactly that would be my dream for almost any city.
Yes.
The second thing that I would say is that, it was Plato who wrote in the Republic that, every city of whatever size is in reality two cities. One, a city of the rich, the other, a city of the poor, and they are perpetually at war with one another. Cities are always places of wealth and poverty because they are relatively pleasant places to be rich, right? Because there are lots of fun ways to spend your money in a city. And they are typically less terrible places to be poor because you can find some form of economic opportunity, often because the welfare state is somewhat easier, often because getting around is somewhat easier. Urban inequality is not itself a problem as long as cities are fulfilling their historic mission of turning poor children into wealthier adults, right? And so upward mobility is the true test of urban success. And I think that's what you need to think about. Now, one of the ways that cities promote upward mobility is they promote mixing between less well-educated and more well-educated people, between rich and poor, and integration. Mixing is typically the way that, skills are transmitted, opportunity occurs, and so forth. And I would have said the challenge is to try to make sure that Hanoi is as mixed in a healthy way as it possibly can be.
Hanoi are trying to build a lot of roads, street, and trying to deal with traffic jam. But the street in front of my house, it has a lot of traffic jam. But when it's get bigger, it's The traffic jam stopped for a little while, but then more traffic jam carry on. So, what kind of road should we build first, and how long can it last?
So cities do need infrastructure.
Mhm.
They do need roads, but it's important to recognize that there is something called the fundamental law of highway traffic, which has been identified by the economists Gilles Duranton and Matthew Turner, who find that vehicle miles traveled increase roughly 1 for 1 with highway miles built. If you build the more roads, you will get more drivers. And so there's no way to just build your way out of traffic congestion. Maybe for a brief period, as you suggest, the traffic gets worse and then more people just start driving. And, Vietnam is a country which is just going to get richer and richer, and wealthier people like driving cars. Now, I don't know the current state of the discussion around congestion charging in Hanoi, but this is the right strategy. Singapore has had and I know that Hanoi has been considering it. Singapore has had congestion charging since 1975,
Mhm.
and it is a relatively non-congested city, precisely because it charges people enough to stop them from clogging up city streets, right? There's no, whatever one thinks about sort of positive aspects of, building infrastructure, uh, it will always elicit a behavioral response. And that behavioral response has the ability to completely undo the benefits of the infrastructure unless something sensible is done, like using prices to ration relatively limited city space. So I think the case of Hanoi, like most places, the key is to just charge drivers sufficiently much to use roads, especially during prime periods, that they don't clog up city streets. Ideally, congestion charges actually help poor people as well. As long as poor people are taking buses or other forms of public transportation, or maybe taking bicycles, you're freeing up space on city streets for the poor people to travel by charging the rich drivers more.
But Hanoi, there are a lot of shipper. The shipper are mostly on the street. They carry people to work. They carry material for building, because Hanoi is building a lot of tall skyscraper.
Yeah.
So if we charge the vehicle, so mostly the poor people will have to be to bear with the charge.
Um, it's very rarely the right thing to try to help poor people by screwing up prices. So the right thing to do is to make sure that you have policies that help poor people. Above all, that's good education for the children of the poor. It may also be a stronger social safety net to make sure that people don't go hungry, to make sure you have basic health care available for the poor. These are the right things to do, not to ensure that every poor person has access to city streets whenever they want them for free. Right. So, and in fact, many poor people will benefit from not having traffic congestion being as bad. So I think this is not the right way to engage in policies for the poor. The right way to engage in policies for the poor are policies that directly enable upward mobility.
I understand. And also there are another things that very typical to Hanoi. There are a lot of cultural heritages, from the monarchic time and colonial time for over 1,000 years. And there are a lot of debate about what to keep, and what to do with the heritages. So, what is a good strategy for preserving the heritages?
There's no right answer on this. There's no one perfect answer. And there's no way as an outsider that I should be opining as to which parts of Vietnam's heritage need to be protected versus not. The only thing that's critical is that you have, decision makers who are weighing the costs and benefits on this. And I think that's the critical thing, because preserving some form of heritage is crucial. It may not be the case that all heritage needs to be preserved, and there are costs, right? You're making it more difficult to build in those areas. You're making it more difficult to change. So things that are 1,000 years old, usually you probably do want to protect. If they're things that are 30 years old, maybe it's not so vital if they be protected. And a lot of what passes for historic preservation in the US is for things that were done after World War II of very little architectural importance, and yet they still get protected. So I can't give you one right answer. I can just say it's really important that the benefits of historic preservation be weighed against the costs of making it difficult to change the city.
Economics of location, economic of place. Can you tell me more about that field? Because it seems to be quite new and I haven't heard of it recently.
So there is the field of urban economics, the study of the economics of cities, is related to economic geography and the economics of location, right? In part because you don't understand why cities exist. You can't understand why cities exist if you don't understand why they're so productive, right? So the productivity of cities is sort of central to their appeal. There is a literature that goes back, 50 years, which is specifically on various things that make some places more productive than others. And places become more productive not just because there are natural attributes, a port, a coal mine, that actually add productivity, but they become more productive because other people are there. They become more productive because you can work with other people, because you can buy or sell from other people, because you can learn from other people. And these are called agglomeration economies. And we now have a 50-year empirical literature on this. Logically, all agglomeration economies come down to reducing transportation costs, because that's what proximity ultimately gives you, is a reduced cost of interaction, reduced cost of transportation. But they need to be understood as transportation costs for goods, for people, and for ideas. All of these things go down. All those costs go down. And so there's a lot of work trying to figure out which industries benefit most from proximity. That's changed over time. So 120 years ago, manufacturing had real benefits from agglomeration. You put the early manufacturing there, in large part also because of access to various forms of transportation hubs. So you wanted to have, the business of slaughtering cows in Chicago. You wanted to put that right next to the rail yard. And so you have these vast stockyards in central Chicago. Or you wanted to make early cars in Detroit that were reasonably close again to rail systems that could move the cars over space. As transportation costs plummeted in the US, right, the agglomeration advantages of manufacturing declined, and cities increasingly became about, services, particularly business services, not about manufacturing.
But the transportation cost goes down. Is this because we don't take into consideration of the climate change?
Well, it is true that transportation costs have declined no matter how you cut it. That in fact, it was just much more expensive to ship anything 100 years ago than it is now. But you're of course correct that we in fact treat transportation costs as if they're lower than they actually are because we ignore the climate costs. And that's right. We also ignore the congestion costs. And so, for example, I'm convinced that there's too much Amazon, online shipping in New York City because the trucks that are going around Manhattan aren't paying for the congestion that they create, right? And in the same sense, we have too much shipping over space because we haven't internalized the cost of the carbon emissions to the larger environment.
Another question, come back to Hanoi. So, the apartments in Hanoi too expensive for the newly arrived people. So they have to live in a kind of cheap building, which might have a high risk of catastrophe. What can we do about it?
Well, there are at least two strategies for that. One of which is they have to get richer, okay, which I think they will continue to do. So Vietnam needs to continue to, become a wealthy and successful country. Above all, this involves education. I tend to think that the three critical things for economic success are smart people, small entrepreneurial firms, and connections to the outside world. All three of these things will help Hanoi to continue to get rich. But at the same time, the price of housing will come down if Hanoi continues to build. So building, I think, is good. Of course, building that has a substantial chance of falling down and killing people is not so good. So, and this is a trade-off of, how difficult do you want the inspection process to be? How difficult do you want the rules to be? I tend to think that inspections that are just focused on public safety are pretty justifiable. Inspections that are based on other things are, let's say, less easy. Inspections that are based on aesthetics or other things, I think that's less clear that's good. But I mean, those are the two. Build more housing and continue to get rich.
Hanoian people have to deal with the traffic jam at least 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour in the afternoon. I always try to avoid that because it's terrible. I don't understand how people can to bear with the smoke, the noise, the slow, and you have to stay in the street for 1 hour or maybe more, and in the rainy day, which is quite often in Hanoi. Do you think that the company they should be a little bit more independent in choosing the hour to work to avoid that kind of traffic jam?
I think it's hard. I mean, in general, companies, I would think, would make the right decisions for them and their workers, but you would think it would make sense for a bunch of companies to start earlier and a bunch of companies to start later, so that you smooth out commuting patterns a little bit more. I'm a little bit surprised that they aren't doing more of that. It does tend to be the case that it's, a version of agglomeration economies occurs at the company level. And so the companies often want all the workers to be there at the same time. And so that creates a certain amount of bumping. But I think that the most important policy is to be looking at congestion charging now, and then to figure out what needs to be done in the public transportation sphere to go along with this. I mean, there's an old line that Harvard's transportation economics can be boiled down to, to 4 words: bus good, train bad. And I think the more that you can create just lanes that are, used by very few drivers, the more that you can put buses going at a relatively fast pace on those lanes. And that remains, things like bus rapid transit are some of the most appealing ways that we have for dealing with, the mass commuting problem.
Hanoi actually have tried the bus route transit, but they decide to have a lane only for the bus, so it go faster. But after a few years, like 2 or 3 years, that seemed to be a failure because it make more traffic jam because it take up the space for the car or for the motorbike. So the people always go into that.
They go into the bus lane?
Yes, they go into the bus lane.
Well, you need to protect the bus lane, otherwise it doesn't work. So you need to you need either put in Brazil, they had to put in walls to stop the thing. So they put in a hard barrier to stop things going in there. Alternatively, you can use very high fines. So if you get a very large fine by going into the bus lane, you won't go into the bus lane.
Okay. A lot of parents bring their children to school, so they will create that kind of traffic jam.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe the educational system has to work more with different opening hours and closing hours. Maybe they need to be moved around to smooth the commute to schools. Maybe we need to rethink the locations of the schools. Maybe the schools can be located in areas that involves less commuting on the part of the parents to do so. But that's right. If you have 3 million students, that's going to cause a huge amount of congestion.
Yeah. So
and thinking about how to be smart about that is really crucial.
If the policymaker Hanoi they want to really calculate what to do better with the traffic jam, they have to take into a lot of consideration. And then, but you cannot decide. You cannot ask the Ministry of Education to do something, or you cannot ask the company to do other things. So you actually cannot decide for the other people. So it seems to be like a very top-down policy.
Well, that's the beauty of congestion charging. If you just charge people enough, if you charge them the social cost of their actions, then they'll make the right decisions without you trying to figure out what they should be doing. That's the whole logic of a congestion charge. Is you just charge them that, and then let the schools figure it out.
Okay. So
and you charge less if you go at 6:30 a.m. rather than 7:30 a.m. So then maybe everyone decides we're going to save money by starting at 7 a.m. instead of at 9 a.m. It's all about, using the prices to move people around.
I understand. So that seems to be making a lot of sense now because we cannot wait for a big top-down decision to move everything around. So you have to ask everyone a little bit a hand to help in this situation. But for the charging, does it need kind of a smart or modern or expensive system to to calculate and to charge automatically?
So first of all, I think Vietnam could manage a very, I understand Vietnam is not incredibly rich yet, but it will be very rich soon, and it's full of very smart people. And so I believe you can figure out how to do this. Singapore did it when in 1975, when it was poorer than you are now and considerably less technologically sophisticated. They just did it with certificates. They just said, if you want to drive within the city during a time of day, you have to pay this. Then they moved to transponders. So they have a big, they have like things. And if you drive under it, you have to have a charger and it charges against that. Now they're moving to full GPS based time of day charging. I would have guessed that you can handle transponders at this point in time, but if you can't, then you just have to make people buy certificates and they have to drive with the certificates. But there are all sorts of technologies and, and you can make it more and more sophisticated as you go along.
So once the decision is made, we can do with whatever we have, right? Like the best we have. So just to go with the decision.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, Edward. I think that's the question that I have for today. And thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much. Thank you for publishing my book, for both books, and thank you for talking to me.